On today's show, I'll be speaking to public policy expert Matt Robison, getting into the thorny issues of tech regulation. He has a master's degree in public policy from the Harvard University Kennedy School. He has a long resume, too long to cover fully here, and it includes serving as legislative director for Congressman John Baldacci and Michael Michaud, and chief of staff for Congressman Paul Hodes, and running the congressional campaign for John Tierney, and serving as the policy director for the New Hampshire State Senate. These days, Matt hosts several politics and current event shows on WKXL in New Hampshire, and also publishes the Beyond Politics podcast, which you can find on all major podcasting platforms. And that's just one of the 3 podcasts that Matt hosts and produces.
There are plenty of case studies of successful advancement of ultimately very big societal change, big regulation, big legislation that started small and had some of these key ingredients in it.
So with that as background, I'm super excited to have him on for a discussion on why it's so much harder to get meaningful regulations passed in the US as we see happening in Europe. Obviously, I'm talking about regulations around EMF emissions, but I'm also interested in learning more about less controversial policies, like the right to disconnect and the right to have a single charger work on all of our phones, both of which we see happening in Europe right now. So really, the question I want to get into today is, why is it so difficult to get the US government to address problems that emerge at the intersection of health and technology, like the kinds of rules we're seeing emerge in Europe? Before we begin, a brief word. This podcast is brought to you by my company, Shield Your Body, where it is our mission to help make technology safer for you and your loved ones to enjoy. Inspired by the life's work of my father, Dr. Martin Blank, one of the world's leading EMF scientists, I founded Shield Your Body in 2012, and we provide a ton of great and free resources for you to learn all about EMF radiation, like articles, ebooks, webinars, and videos. And we also have a world-class catalog of laboratory-tested EMF and 5G protection products, from our phone pouch and laptop pad, all the way up to our bed canopy. All of our products are laboratory tested and include a lifetime warranty. Learn more about our products and why we have hundreds of thousands of satisfied customers around the world at shieldyourbody.com. That's shieldyourbody, all one word, .com, or click the link in the show notes and use promo code POD to save 15% on your first order with free shipping throughout North America, the UK, and Europe. Hi, Matt. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. So, before we get into anything, full disclosure to everyone, Matt is my cousin, and credit where credit is due. I think this is actually the first time anyone said this publicly, but Matt is the guy who actually came up with the name for the Overpowered book that I wrote with my father. And I mentioned it here because as time goes on, I feel like that name ages really well. It's more and more meaningful to me every year because it really gets to the heart of the EMF issue in just one word, that these devices are literally overpowered. They literally emit more power than is healthy, but even more than that, they emit more power than is necessary. So on behalf of everyone, Matt, thank you very much for that title. And when you graciously had me on your Beyond Politics podcast, you shared some nice memories of my father because you knew him quite well, didn't you?
I did. I felt very warmly toward your dad. He was really an extraordinary guy, and I'm not sure how much that comes through. There's only so much you can capture that when you talk about someone and kind of their scientific achievements and their career. But he was a really fascinating guy. He actually officiated my wedding. I'm Jewish. We're Jewish. I married, my wife is Catholic, and so we had a Catholic deacon, and we had my Uncle Marty as the stand-in rabbi. And what was so amazing was as we prepared for the ceremony and we kind of broke it down with him in prep, he could give a full biblical explanation for why something was part of a Jewish wedding ceremony. Then he could trace the history of how it had evolved across time and in different cultures, and then explain his take and approach on it. So every part of that was sort of like getting a 5 minutes things you didn't know podcast on every topic having to do with the Jewish wedding. It was absolutely amazing.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. So because of Dad, you've been aware, like all of us in the family, of the EMF issue for quite a while. And of course, you also know about the work I and my team do here at SYB. When you combine that with your extensive public policy experience, You also have a good idea of why EMF has been so hard to regulate. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. I think about the challenge of passing anything through our system of government. I sort of think about it in four buckets. So I'll kind of try and hit them one at a time. The first one that I think really super applies to EMF is who owns it? At what level of government are you addressing the problem? Because you have federal jurisdiction, you have state jurisdiction, and in some cases, you have local jurisdiction. Just at the federal level, the question when it comes to regulating the emissions from electromagnetic sources, is it the Federal Trade Commission? Because you have a lot of consumer products, obviously, that use electricity. Is it the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, which oversees where transmission power lines go? Is it OSHA? Because people are bathed in this type of radiation in the workplace. Is it a public health issue? As we've seen with COVID, a lot of the regulation, mask regulation and distancing, has been undertaken by local boards of public health. And so you have this, when you have this mishmash, this overlapping set of who's on first, what's on second type government, it becomes a kind of many hands problem. Who owns it? Who's taking charge of it? And that just creates confusion.
So when you have that kind of landscape in terms of managing regulations, ideally, I guess you'd want legislature to kind of provide some clarity on what needs to be done. Is that?
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. In theory, the legislature, in this case, the U.S. Congress, although at the state level, it could be the state legislature, they're supposed to be the ones that make policy. They're the ones that are supposed to make law. And that kind of gets to my second bucket of problems, which is, how do you actually get that done? This feels like I'm just a bill sitting here on Capitol Hill. How does a bill become a law? Well, one of the ways that a bill becomes a law is it has a champion, because you're going to have to overcome opposition. And in this case, there are plenty of embedded interests, and they're not evil. When I say interests, it sounds like I'm saying something sinister. I'm not necessarily, but if you're talking about adding regulation and potentially cost to everything that we make that runs on electricity and the entire way we power our society, there are going to be companies and individuals who are upset about that. So you need a powerful champion. Well, you need to get someone on board to do that. But I'll just, kind of throw in the third bucket of problem, which is Congress, as I think most people know, is it something of a deadlock. The productivity of Congress has been steadily decreasing, and you can see it in all kinds of statistics that I won't bore listeners with, but Congress is passing less and less meaningful legislation. It's finding it harder and harder to just do its annual homework of passing the federal budget. It's not able to confirm nominees to positions. And so Congress is kind of at a deadlock. And so even if you have a champion, it's just at baseline not easy to move anything through the U.S. Congress these days. It's a little easier in state legislatures, but that's not necessarily a cakewalk either.
So how do you get things done in Washington or any state capital these days?
Well, it takes a lot of shoe leather. It takes a lot of hard work. And, one of the keys in the super partisan political environment that we have created for ourselves, this wonderful political world that we've all brought our kids into these days, is that there's almost a zen of how to get something done. You have to make sure that it doesn't end up in the political crosshairs. Anything that gets too much attention, that you advocate for too hard, will automatically create sort of an equal and opposite law of thermodynamics, law of motion, kind of an equal and opposite reaction from the other party. And so you almost need to fly under the radar and not turn something into, and even then, it's no guarantee. Just take, for example, the infrastructure bill. This is something that President Trump had tried to get passed for 4 years. It was a widely agreed upon priority across Republicans and Democrats. And when it came to a vote, 13 Republicans voted for it, and they were immediately excoriated by their own party. There were calls for them to be thrown out of the party, including from former President Trump, and to lose their committee seats, and that they're no longer Republicans. And that's just the level we've reached. So it's very, very difficult to pass things. It's very difficult if they have any attention. And what it usually takes is kind of the right confluence of ingredients, having a good champion, having some level of bipartisan agreement, either a mutual non-aggression pact, we're not going to fight it out on this one, or just enough bipartisanship that you can get something through. We did sentencing reform that way, and an awful lot of hustle over a lot of time.
That's interesting. So I'm glad that you're bringing some actual examples of success actually happening. But it's interesting to me the way you talk about the need to, depoliticize, or you use the word Zen, approach a topic or an issue with that sort of coolness in order to actually see progress. And you mentioned a couple of characteristics in particular, the question was originally about EMF and EMF regulations. But I'd like to pivot that just a little bit because, I focus a lot about EMF issues. But I and many others, I think a growing number of others, believe that there are a whole set of health issues stemming from our relationship with technology. I mean, that's the entire premise of this Healthier Tech podcast. So certainly EMF is an issue regarding health and technology, but there are other ones as well. So with some of these other issues, I think we do see more of a public understanding, a greater public willingness to act, and I don't know if you want to say bipartisan or nonpartisan interest. And the example that comes to mind, which is pretty fresh in everyone's memory, is the one of I believe it's pronounced Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Right. Well, first of all, I totally agree, and I think you're onto something really smart with this podcast, which is, Dwight Eisenhower is famous for a lot of things. He had a saying: if you have a difficult problem, I actually think he said it an intractable problem, but that's a $100 word. If you have a difficult problem, enlarge it. Look at the bigger picture, is what he's saying, and deal with that whole context. And you're totally right that there is a growing realization, and we see it to some degree with the Facebook revelations. There's a growing realization, first of all, that mental health and physical health are part of the same continuum. And so if tech is harming our mental health, then that's just as deep and profound an impact on us as an effect on our physical health. Actually, that distinction is sort of stupid on its face. But there's also, I think, a growing realization in the last 5 years, especially about, this is going to sound highfalutin, I don't mean it to, but about our societal health. In a very real way, the functioning of our politics, of our public discourse, of our ability to kind of understand current events and news and what's happening in the world around us is being shaped, skewed, perhaps even warped by our relationship with technology and the filter through which we understand the world, which is increasingly technology-based and social media-based. We've seen it in the insurrection. We've seen it in misinformation. We've seen it in vaccine misinformation, scientific misinformation. And that, of course, takes us around the circle back to EMF. So that's a great point. And to your question about the Facebook whistleblower, what that is about is revelations from Ms. Haugen that Facebook knew, based on their own internal work, their own internal research, that their products were causing harm, that they had evidence of that. Now, it wouldn't take people much of a Google to find that this isn't exactly a slam dunk scientific case yet. There's different psychologists, different social scientists will say, well, the evidence may be a little mixed. We haven't totally nailed this, but that's beside the point. The point is, this company was doing its own research, and its own research was coming back, and the system was flashing red. It was saying, look, teen girls are reporting significant harms, especially. We've seen from 2010 to 2014, the rates of hospital admission for self-harm for girls aged 10 to 14 has doubled. And you're just seeing a major confluence with social media usage, and particularly Instagram, Snapchat, these visual interactive social media that really focus on the face and the way you look and body image. And so that is the issue that I think brought to the fore some of the deep problems with Facebook, and began to forge some of, as you put it, that bipartisan awareness. And what you began to see in the whistleblower hearings in Congress was bipartisan awareness. You saw Republican and Democratic senators saying things like, Section 230, which is the part of the Communications Decency Act of 1996 that sort of governs how Facebook is regulated, and the fact that it's lightly regulated or not really regulated at all. You saw Republicans and Democrats talking about Section 230. You saw members of both parties talking about the Facebook algorithm. I mean, there's a $100 word. They're talking about the way in which artificial intelligence baked into social media is warping people's brains without sort of our full understanding or control of the process. So yes, there is, I think it is a great analogy, and it's a great sort of opening point for a larger discussion about how is tech impacting our individual physical health, our individual mental health, and our collective societal health.
That was so I have so many questions after that. But what about, I mean, because you talk about in particular this period of time being a hyper-partisan period of time. And this is an issue at the intersection of tech and health, and issues at that intersection have proven sort of challenging to garner public interest and bipartisan support. What do you think about the issues at the center of the Facebook leak make this different? Make the legislative and governmental and regulatory response different? And we should point out nothing has actually happened yet. But even getting this far is different than we've seen. Certainly on the EMF issue, but also on other issues related to tech health and tech privacy. What might be some of the characteristics about what's happening right now with the Facebook leaks that are different?
Well, I'm a Democrat, and so I am afflicted by Democrats' disease, which is I feel a deep-seated need to try to persuade people on the basis of facts and evidence. And you know full well that that's not how human beings think. That's not how anyone is persuaded of anything. Actually, it's an open question of whether people are ever persuaded of anything. What people respond to is story. It's narrative. And I think what you see in the Facebook saga, we can even call it the meta saga, what you really see in that is a story. There's a narrative. There's a villain. There's a revelation. There's a surprise twist. And that's what happens with these kinds of whistleblower revelations. And it can be a turning point that can take an issue, especially an issue, as you say, that falls at the intersection of science or technology and public health, and has it go from sort of a resting state, kind of a quiescent state, to suddenly exploding into the public consciousness. We saw this, for example, in the case of tobacco with Jeffrey Wigand, the tobacco insider. They made the movie The Insider, the 60 Minutes story, where he came forward and he said, look, the companies know about the science here. They know about the harm they're causing. That was the key. It went from, hey, the jury is still out scientifically. We don't really know. We're doing our best. It was sort of a manageable PR thing for the tobacco companies to say, well, we're making a safer cigarette, less tar, all of those kinds of things. You could see them kind of following a let's play it out communication strategy. We'll just keep stringing this along to all of a sudden, this was a totally different issue. You saw it with the Catholic Church abuse scandal. Again, I'll reference another movie, Spotlight. The most famous moment of the movie Spotlight is Mark Ruffalo, who's a wonderful actor, but engaging in a little bit of overacting and screaming, "They knew, they knew." Well, that's exactly the kind of thing that I think can change an issue, can rip it sort of out of this. It's in the background. Yeah, maybe it's something to worry about, but look, there's so many things to worry about in the world and in modern life that it's easy for people to kind of let it settle into the haze. And this kind of revelation yanks it to the forefront. And so, yeah, I agree. I mean, it's not like we've quite gotten there, but I would say that the issue of how we regulate social media has profoundly changed in the last year on the basis of the whistleblower. It's just at a whole different level of consciousness in the public. And, we have the beginnings of maybe there will be some momentum legislatively. We don't know. We don't know where it'll go. But I do think that is the kind of turn. And I know, I mean, you talk about this on your show all the time with a public health issue like seatbelts. I mean, not to turn the question around on you, but I mean, is that your experience when you look at this, that it kind of takes a revelation or sort of a moment to break into the public consciousness?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and the tables are being turned. I feel like I am not an expert on that particular type of question. I feel I do keep a close eye on these issues, and it definitely feels to me that something has changed in the public approach to the perceptions of technology. Matt, as you know, and as many of my listeners know, I had a 20-year career in software development working for companies like Apple and Microsoft. And I was firmly entrenched in the California tech vibe where innovation is fantastic and give me more tech and everything that's new is great. And even before that, as a child of, I don't know what you want to call it, but, the 90s more or less, when the web was literally created and released to the world. And there was so much promise and such a positive vibe around all of this innovation. And that continued for decades. And there was just this kind of implicit bias that technology is always good. And I feel like for the first time, really, in the past year, there've always been people who were advocating or talking about the downsides of technology, but they were just such a minority voice. But within the past year, something has changed where there is I don't know if it's a tipping point yet, but something like a tipping point where people suddenly are capable of thinking that technology can be harmful. And obviously I spend a lot of time talking about EMF. But the harm can come from multiple different vectors. And so your mental state, because of all of the fear of missing out or the comparisons when you check out your friends' Instagram walls, the loss of sleep that you have just from the attention-grabbing addictive mechanisms that are in play here, all of these various factors, and beyond that, going into the issues of pollution and technology waste. What happens with all of the devices once you throw them out. Something definitely has changed in the past year. Now, and we're gonna get to this in a second. The differences between the United States and other parts of the world. I feel like while something has definitely changed, nothing has actually happened yet. So there's been a change in public perception. And I'd say a pretty fundamental one, right? Where technology can do no harm, it is only good. To wait a second, there are some costs here. There are some real costs here. We need to think about it. But that's as far as it's gone. I feel,
Well,
in the
can,
US.
can I make a point about that, though? Because I think that there's sort of an embedded, I agree with everything you're saying. And I think there's sort of an embedded good news or bad news version of that we can tell ourselves. The bad news version is that there are certainly cases where science develops or revelations emerge about a public health issue or a technology, and then it sort of wanders in the wilderness for a long time. So, an example of that might be sugar. It's kind of like tobacco in that we know that 40 and 50 years ago, going back to the 1950s, food companies funded science blaming fat for heart disease and many other health ails. And it was sort of the fat makes you fat theory, which we've seen is scientifically not right. And that work may have sent us on a multi-decade wild goose chase on fat when there's an increasing amount of evidence that sugar, added sugar, is a bigger problem for diabetes, heart disease, and other major physical health ailments. And so it is possible for things like this to sort of wander in the wilderness, even as there's growing public consciousness. And we've certainly seen that in the case of sugar. We've also seen that in the most famous case, which is climate change, public awareness of how deep a problem. And we should really use the term global warming, because climate change is a euphemism invented by anti-global warming people. But global warming is, again, something where we've made stunning progress, and yet we're still kind of stuck in terms of actual accomplishment. But the other side of the coin is, yes, it takes things a long time to develop, but it's still meaningful to kind of cross the Rubicon in terms of public consciousness and legislative awareness. And a great historical example of that was the quest for civil rights legislation. It was a multi-decade quest in Congress that was stymied by the Southern bloc in the US Senate that would filibuster civil rights legislation to death. And so what happened prior to the eventual passage of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 was that under then Senate leader Lyndon Johnson, Democrats were able to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1957. It didn't do a whole heck of a lot. It wasn't much of an accomplishment. Advocates for a real robust civil rights bill found it incredibly disappointing and almost a waste of time. But what historians have found is that it created an opening. It created a different mindset, and it showed what might be possible. And it really paved the way. We wouldn't have had 1964 without 1957. So there are certainly examples of that when it comes to public health, and there's a lot more work to do. But I don't think it's entirely a bad news story when it comes to how long a trajectory EMF and social media regulation may be on. It may be a long journey, but I think there's been a palpable change, and we've gotten going.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I appreciate you bringing that note of optimism explicitly into the conversation, because I did not mean to undervalue the change that I was talking about having seen within the past year. I think it is major. I think it is significant. I was only commenting that it has only gone so far thus far. Although, to be fair, it has only gone so far thus far in the United States. The Facebook leaks, like the issues of EMF, are about public policy at the intersection of health and technology. And in some other episodes this season, we discuss other issues that exist at the same intersection. Issues like the right to disconnect, the right to be forgotten. And these are issues, I'm bringing them up now, because these are issues that have seen significant traction in the European Union, even while they have seen significantly less traction in the United States, right? So the right to disconnect is, for those who haven't heard that episode, that is the right to just not be bothered by your employer after work by email or by phone. That is the law already in several EU nations, and it is highly likely to become the law throughout the EU. That is, it might not sound it at first, but that is an issue that is squarely in the intersection of health and technology. What are, Matt, based on your experience in public policy in the United States, what are some of the factors why you think some of these, very important issues have had so much more success in Europe than they have in the United States?
I I'm afraid that I'm going to give a bit of a squishy answer to this, especially for a show that's largely about science. And again, as I mentioned before, I just it's in my DNA that I feel like I need facts, figures, and statistics in order to make my case. I don't really have them in this question because I do think it ultimately boils down to cultural differences. We've seen that the European Union, across a whole host of issues, just at baseline, those countries have a culture that's much stronger on consumer protection, that is much more aggressive about pursuing monopoly. There's an embedded skepticism about technology, and there's a very, in my view, there's a very healthy appreciation for consumer privacy. And all of those things, there are threads of them in United States political culture, but there are also threads that run the opposite way. And we've been going through, for example, on monopoly, we've been going through a long period in the US of very little regulation of mergers and acquisitions and monopoly power, especially in the tech sector. There's been relatively little litigation or enforcement, and there's been relatively little policymaking in that area. And of course, advocates, particularly when it comes to social media, are very interested in the anti-competitive and monopoly aspects of these big social media companies. There's also, you see some of these threads play out in issues like genetically modified organisms. The EU, just much more comfort at baseline with being aggressive about regulating GMOs versus in the US. There's also a thread of US political culture that's more associated with the Republican Party. And I'm not trying to say this as a pejorative. It's just sort of a description that is in favor of big business, that is against regulation at baseline. What did Ronald Reagan say? Government is the problem. And so it's almost become a way of proving one's bona fides as a Republican to oppose regulation and now even to oppose science. And that's not all Republicans. Again, I'm not trying to cast any aspersions here too wide a net, but it is the case that the Republican Party, to sort of prove themselves, Republican politicians tend to be against climate science, and they've been very skeptical, and we have data on this, very skeptical on vaccines and COVID vaccine and the science of mask wearing. And so I do think ultimately it comes down to some of these cultural differences, and then that translates into political parties and political action, and which is why you have a green party, a healthy green party in many of these EU countries, and you have a significant labor movement and or labor party, whereas it's a much more mixed bag in the US.
So, okay, so let's take that as a given. There are these cultural differences. There is a strong anti-regulatory thread running throughout the United States. I take your point that you see that in the Republican Party, but I think you also see it in the Democratic Party, particularly flowing from who's donating to their campaign. So we have this kind of landscape with these basically a different culture that you talked about. But at the same time, as you noted, we had these hearings earlier this year where members of both parties seemed very concerned about how Facebook was acting and seemed, I don't know if interested is the open to the idea of revisiting the safe harbor provision of the Communications Act that you were talking about earlier. And so how do we get, right? Because there's something happening here where despite these cultural differences, there seems to be an opening, an opportunity for something to happen. So how do we get from where we are now, where there's this potential for something to happen, to actually getting government to help address the problems that emerge at the intersection of health and technology?
It's a long road, as we were talking about earlier. And there are different right answers here. There are different case studies and pathways to success. But I think there are a few ingredients that go into a success story in different combinations. One is, I do think that at some level, as much as I've sort of been a little negative on the role of facts in persuasion, at some level, facts do matter. You do need a case to be made that there's a harm here. You actually kind of need that if you're going to try to get an agency to make a rule, to regulate. Frequently, they're required to do a cost-benefit analysis on their rule. And so you need to know what the cost is, and you need to know what the benefit is. You need to know what harm to the public you're avoiding through the rule, which ultimately comes from the science. So it could be in the case of EMF, it could be in the case of social media and self-harm to teen girls, all across the tech impact landscape. There is a role for science and facts. There's also an equal role for having a good story to tell, having harmed people, having a poster child, for lack of a better word, to be able to tell your story. And it super duper helps if that poster child happens to fall in the state or district of a powerful member of Congress or a legislator, if you're working on the state level, that can advance your cause and be a champion for what you're trying to accomplish. Sometimes it can even be a matter of just finding the right language to make legislators feel the impact of the issue you're talking about. I was working on telecommunications regulation, trying to get more broadband built in the late 1990s. And I was working with an advocacy team. I was more on the sort of statistics and science end of it. And one day, one of our consultants, he had a great Southern accent. I think he was a Texan. We were talking about all the great facts and figures we had. And he said, look, what you really need is you need a catchphrase here. What I want you to do is take your bottom least broadband connected states. And it doesn't matter how many you've got, but it's great if your phrase has, if it rhymes or it has alliteration. So let's call it the disconnected dozen. And just say that these states are the disconnected dozen. Put that out. Doesn't matter the rest of the things you say. Well, 2 years after that conversation, I ended up actually working in Congress. And when I was talking to some of my new colleagues, it turned out that the legislation that we had been advocating for, they had all gotten their bosses onto that legislation. Why? Because they heard that their state or their district was part of the disconnected dozen. That was something that resonated. So, it's helpful to have these kinds of ingredients in the case. And then the final thing I'll say is it's helpful to try to make this. There's an old piece of advice. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And when you have a big, difficult, intractable problem like EMF, which really does pervade everything we do in society, it may not be the best strategy to try and tackle the whole darn thing at once. So frequently, a successful strategy is start at the state level and get a model piece of legislation passed, get a study passed at the state level, the impact of EMF, perhaps from transmission lines. Get an instruction passed in an appropriation bill. That's how Congress directs how money is going to be spent from the federal budget. Get a line inserted into an appropriation bill forcing the FTC to hold hearings on EMF or the impact of consumer goods that may be at high voltage. Find small successes that you can build on. None of this is easy, but there are plenty of case studies of successful advancement of ultimately very big societal change, big regulation, big legislation that started small and had some of these key ingredients in it.
Can you think of one?
Well, you talk about the seatbelt example. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great one.
Yeah, no, and actually that it in Overpowered, that's what that's the metaphor that we drew in that book, because maybe a little less so now, but 10 years ago when we wrote that book, you talk about concerns about EMF and health, and people sort of assume you're talking about banning cell phones, and that's not the case any more than when you're talking about highway deaths. You're not talking, the solution isn't to ban cars. It's, a solution looks like something like seatbelts. And it, for people growing up today, it might be difficult even to imagine a world in which cars did not have seatbelts, but it really wasn't that long ago. And it did require a big shift in public opinion. And it was super successful in terms of reducing fatalities.
Right. And you see a lot of the ingredients in the seatbelt example that we were just talking about. First of all, you have a long trajectory. The arc of the regulatory universe is frequently long, but it does bend toward justice, to really butcher Martin Luther King. And so, you're talking about Unsafe at Any Speed comes out in 1965. You're talking about a decade, 2 decades, and more to really see seatbelt laws, mandatory seatbelt wearing, play out across 49 states. It took a long time, but what were the ingredients you had? Well, first of all, you had the science, you had the data, you had the facts. Second, you had poster children, and they were conveniently or horribly located all across the country and in key districts and in key states. So you could get attention and an attachment from politicians to stories that are happening with their own constituents in their own backyard. And then what you saw was eating the elephant a bite at a time, getting the installation of seatbelts to be mandatory. Just the fact that you had to force auto manufacturers to just put them in the darn cars, well, that was a big step. It didn't force everyone to wear them, but it was a necessary first step that paved the way for everything else. So yeah, I think that's a great model. It's not following this kind of a pathway. Again, it's not a prescription for definite success. You see advocates, and this isn't an issue that I necessarily myself fully agree with, but you see people who are worried about genetically modified organisms. We're sort of following this pathway starting about a decade ago, and they were bringing up science, and they were trying to create examples of perceived harms with genetically modified alfalfa and how it meant that all of our milk was eventually going to be genetically modified. Did we want that? And then they were trying what they called the Just Label It campaign. They were going state to state in state legislatures and trying to enforce labeling. And sometimes that kind of approach hasn't worked for that issue. It has worked in other cases. California air regulations, which was a kind of a state-by-state strategy, ended up governing what we do across the country because auto manufacturers don't want to deal with a patchwork of regulations, so they just adhere to what's in place in the biggest market in the country. So yes, I do think while all of these examples can be double-edged, there's no guarantees here, there are definitely pathways to success, and the seatbelt example is a good one.
So again, it just feels like you're very optimistic, and I do like that. I do appreciate, especially in these challenging times. Where do you? And I hate to put you on the spot, but where do you think let's just focus again on the issues raised by the Facebook whistleblower. Where do you think that is going to go in a year or 2 years?
That is really hard. That is really, really hard to tell because it is so tied up in politics. It's so tied up in the run up to the next election. The basic dynamics we were talking about the infrastructure bill. I mean, it may be that Congress is unable to pass any significant legislation in the next year. Where as we record this, we're on the cusp of maybe the Biden Build Back Better bill will ultimately come together and get passed. But after that, it's really unclear. We may just be in a period of deadlock. And then if, as anticipated, the Republicans win back both chambers of Congress, we don't know that that'll happen, but that's what's currently looking more likely for 2022. You would have a whole new set of people in charge of committees and in charge of what makes it to the floor of each chamber of Congress. And so it is really hard and almost fundamentally unknowable. I do think that we saw the beginning of momentum, and I'm talking to advocates out there. I actually had one of the major ones, Jeff Hauser. He actually comes out of the labor movement. He was on my Beyond Politics show and sort of talking about this push. You do see advocates trying to think about how to break out this issue into manageable bite-sized chunks, including going after the anti-competitive aspects of the companies, particularly Facebook, trying to deepen the research on harms, especially to young girls, but more broadly. I do think one thing that is very likely to happen is that Democrats are going to push hard on revelations from the January 6th investigative committee. And there is a social media aspect to that speaks to societal harms. That may be a window into the world of misinformation that will once again raise in the public consciousness the issue of just how harmful the social media filtration
I'm sorry to cut
of the
you,
world is. Oh, go ahead.
No, but that puts it squarely back in the partisan framing, which you said is sort of death to any sort of initiative.
It does. And that's why this may kind of go in fits and starts, and advocates have to be super careful. They especially because Republicans may be in charge. For all we know, not to freak people out. I don't know if there are Donald Trump fans among your listener base, but
there certainly are.
Well, good news for you. We may have Donald Trump back in 2024. So, advocates have to be kind of careful about this, but I'm sort of doing the same thing that Congress does right now in answering your question. I'm filibustering here because it really is so hard to know. I do think there are some milestones up ahead. There are opportunities for advocates to continue to sort of prosecute the public case. I think that the pathway of passing something legislatively is going to be really, really tricky. And what it will probably take is getting inside the brain and figuring out, sort of like with every other question in Washington these days, what does Joe Manchin want to do? What does Susan Collins want to do? What does Mitch McConnell want to do? What do some of these power players in the U.S. Senate want to do? And as you alluded to before, because I don't want to sound too partisan about this, there are Democrats who are on the other side of this. Silicon Valley is predominantly represented by Democrats, and they advocate for these companies. And so if I had to predict something, my best guess is you're not going to see anything legislatively. But what you might see is maybe the introduction of a bipartisan bill that stakes out here's an approach that we could live with that would break off a small piece of this problem, that would be a start. And sometimes that in itself is an accomplishment. It's enough to continue the progression along the pathway to ultimate success.
No, so again, a note of optimism. I appreciate that. I mean, what I hear is in the short term, what we've seen so far just in the recent past is significantly different than what we've seen before that. In the short term, we can hope to make some incremental progress. And the examples from history show that over time, the types of incremental progress that you believe are likely in the short term, they add up to eventually seeing the kind of broader change that I'm talking about this season, in other episodes, happening already in Europe, and we can get to that point in time. Is that fair?
I think that's right. And look, progress in Europe can filter over. It can be a model for what happens in the U.S. And the other thing is, Donald Rumsfeld died recently, and among his more famous riffs, he was a complicated guy, but among his more famous riffs was, there are known knowns. There are known unknowns. There are unknown unknowns. Have I lost people yet? He's just saying that, like, in the world, there are things not only that we don't know, but we don't even know that we don't know them. And I think that's very, very much the case with this entire world of tech and social media and even EMF. There's constantly science being done. There's constantly research being done. If at any point we have a they knew moment on EMF, for example, perhaps on cell phones, because look, the movie Thank You for Smoking came out 15 years ago, and it was the big joke at the end of the movie was the cell phone manufacturers being advised by the PR consultant, don't worry about it. Just say the science is still out there. We're still working on it. Nothing's been proven, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's where the tobacco companies were. And so if at any point we discover, hey, you know what? Actually, this isn't an unknown unknown. This is something that people knew about, that there are some direct harms. You could see a domino effect. You could see regulation to protect people from that kind of intense EMF right next to your brain. You could also then see, hey, if you're having this effect with holding your cell phone up to your head or keeping it in your front pocket, well, what about the rest of the electrified world? And you could see movement happening that way, and perhaps advancement of right to disconnect, or maybe even EMF related regulation or legislation in the EU could start to advance that conversation in the US. Or it could happen on the state level. So yes, I know I'm sounding super optimistic about something that, like, I want to acknowledge is incredibly hard. I mean, we've been at this climate change thing with full awareness of just how bad it is for 30 years and counting. And, the US remains a holdout. None of this is easy. It could be a long, long road, but I think we're on it now. We're definitely on it now. And sometimes change comes faster than you anticipate.
Okay. Well, again, another upbeat note. I really do. It seems
I'm Mr. Sunshine this morning.
Yeah, it's a little bit in contrast to the actual words coming out of your mouth.
Yeah, I feel like the doctor saying, look, this is super scary, your diagnosis, but here's the good news. Here's the lollipop at the end.
Well, thank you so much, Matt, for coming on to the Healthier Tech podcast and sharing some of your insight on this question. Where can my listeners catch more of you?
I would ask everyone to check out the Beyond Politics podcast. It's wherever you find your podcasts. We have really interesting guests, including our blank. We have really interesting guests. We call it Beyond Politics because we definitely cover politics, but we cover news, culture, and society. We really do try and dig a little deeper, like you do on your show. And we have authors and senators and thinkers Really interesting folks kind of looking at what's going on behind the scenes. We had the author of a great book on the whole 25-year plus history of how we got to marriage equality in the U.S. Fascinating researchers and scientists. So Beyond Politics is the podcast. We also have some other shows. I'd mention particularly Great Ideas, which if you aren't so much into the politics, you just want to hear about solutions, policy solutions for problems that we face in society. That's what I cover there. We work with guests who run across the ideological spectrum and offer just ideas. They explain how things work and how to make them a little bit better.
That's great. Yeah, we'll put links to both of those in the show notes. So, Matt, thank you again for coming on to the Healthier Tech podcast. I really enjoyed this conversation and getting a chance to catch up with you.
Me too.
Well, that was quite an interview. As always, I am happy to welcome my co-host, Stephanie. Stephanie, you heard that interview. What stood out to you?
Well, first I want to say, wow, I love this. I love this topic so much. It's, kind of scary to think about how difficult it is to get public policy change around anything related to tech. The biggest takeaway is even just the concept of not just the challenge that we have to get to make public policy, but also the concept that there is this intersection between health and tech, and we see it, but we see it play out, and we have the example of the Facebook whistleblower giving examples of how our tech and social media is harming our health. I have not thought about the concept that phrase is a perfect way to describe where we are now, and the concept that there is this intersection between, health and tech. We also talked about, Matt talked a lot about, this recipe for success. And part of it, and what struck me is that it's a marketing campaign. Like actually getting public policy change is not only a political task, but it's also a marketing task. You have to have, facts aren't necessarily, they're important, but they're not, the most important thing. Really, you need the poster child and you need the narrative.
Yeah, facts are necessary, but not sufficient.
Exactly. Yeah. So it struck me as, a marketing campaign. And I feel like the tagline to think about intersection of health and tech is part of that that recipe that he was talking about.
I think one of the things that stood out to me is and Stephanie, from what we've been doing at SYB that I've been saying this, but I don't think it really kind of hit home to me the way until this interview, which is that thing there has definitely been a shift in public perception of technology. That doesn't mean everyone's against technology. Certainly doesn't mean everyone's given up their AirPods or shutting down their Facebook account. But there is something big has changed in that people can now easily conceive of tech as being harmful in a way that they couldn't or just didn't until now. Except for small segments and small niches. That and Matt was, I think, appropriately optimistic about that. He wanted to emphasize how important that is, because without that crack appearing in public perception, the rest of it is almost hopeless. And having achieved that really does alter the landscape of future possibility.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And, one of the thoughts that I had in listening to the interview is it's hard for me to believe that it could potentially take decades for public policy change, because people are so hyper aware that this stuff isn't good for them. I think, especially when you look at social media usage, gaming, even Netflix addiction, I think people are aware that this is not good for them. They're not willing to take the personal action yet. And it's hard for me to believe that this is going to take decades before people say, hey, you know what? I need to cut back on this. We need public policy change, but we need personal change as well.
Yeah, no, I that I think is key. That I don't think I really covered it explicitly in the interview, but I think it's obvious in the subtext, which is in the face of government inaction, personal action is what we all have the power to do, and we all have the power to stop using Facebook or use Facebook less. We all have the power to turn off our cell phones when we don't want to be reached. And so until there's a right to disconnect, or until Facebook's data management and advertising platforms are better regulated, right? There are things that we can do as individuals that really help us personally and also help move the ball forward.
Yeah, and I think in this case, I feel optimistic that unlike the example of seatbelts, I think people are going to probably take more personal responsibility faster than public policy can catch up. I don't know. Maybe I'm more optimistic, but I feel like we're as a culture going to move faster than public policy. And the irony of this is, I feel that social media and our ability to communicate is what is going to make the change happen faster than public policy, unlike things that we've seen in the past, like with cigarettes and seatbelts.
Another thing that stood out to me, and I guess it's a little ironic that it took a strong partisan to really underscore it for me, but is the need to depoliticize the issue,
Yes.
Especially in the United States right now. Everything is politicized. But even before we got to this current situation, I have long sought to have SYB's messaging be as depoliticized as possible. To be as and I'm not even talking about issues of left and right. I'm talking about not getting into any other issue. Because when you get into any, when you're trying to talk about an issue, especially one as complicated and sometimes controversial as EMF, you want to really just focus on the message and not bring in tangential issues like technology waste or tech addiction, which we're now talking about on this podcast, but which we hadn't been talking about at SYB historically, because I really do see the value in trying to keep politics out of the conversation as much as possible, which is funny when you're talking about ways of enacting public policy. Politics is supposed to be about enacting public policy, but we're saying the best way to achieve better public policy is by leaving politics out of the whole equation.
Yeah, well, I think that that's what we learned in this. We probably know this from looking at the political landscape in the United States now, but also after listening to this interview, it's more and more clear that anything that we want to get done has to be depoliticized if we want, and we need to focus in on the state and local level to make change. So we have the recipe that Matt talked about, but also part of this is really thinking is a long-term strategy in incremental progress and change, and starting on the local level, which when he was talking about that made me think about our advocacy materials regarding EMF on the Shield Your Body website. The strategy that you articulated in those materials is very similar. It's, be very focused in your message. Don't get emotional, and i.e. don't get political, and stay very focused and work locally to get those small successes. And that message resonated with me a lot in this interview as well, because it is something that we have talked about and created materials for, and how to try and get change locally, or how to advocate for yourself.
Yeah.
And those materials also work in, this scenario as well, as advocating for better tech health.
Well, I think bringing it all together, I think the key point that I want to take out of this is really just appreciating the sea change that has happened in the past several months, particularly with the changes resulting from the Facebook whistleblower and seeing the public response, that the public now has openness to thinking of tech as having the potential for harm. And that is really vital as we strive for ways to help people live healthier alongside modern tech, which is the whole purpose of the Healthier Tech podcast. So in close, I just feel like despite all the little details that maybe weren't so uplifting, it was actually kind of an optimistic takeaway from that conversation.
Oh, I agree. I absolutely agree. I think he definitely made me think about some things in a more positive way. And I definitely am leaving the interview feeling more positive about the situation. Like there's action. There are things that we can do. We have some control in our crafting public policy.
Well, that does it for today's episode. Remember, if you like this show and want to hear more, please subscribe. The Healthier Tech Podcast, available on all major podcasting platforms. And if you have a moment, please also leave a review. Reviews are really critical to help more people find this podcast and learn about the important and undercovered topics that we discuss. Also, you can learn more and sign up for our mailing list to get notified when we have new interviews, webinars, ebooks, and sales at shieldyourbody.com. You can also just click that link in the show notes. While you're there at shieldyourbody.com, you can check out our world-class catalog of laboratory-tested EMF and 5G protection products. Don't forget to use promo code POD to save 15% on your first order from shieldyourbody.com with free shipping throughout North America and Europe. Until next time, I'm R. Blank, and I want to thank you so much for tuning into the Healthier Tech Podcast. Always remember to shield your body.